You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Leigh Miller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Voluntary celibacy is having a cultural moment. From Lady Gaga to Lenny Kravitz, numerous celebrities have publicly announced that they're taking a break from sex in recent years. But this isn't just a Hollywood phenomenon. It turns out that a lot of people seem to be hitting the pause button on their sex lives, which is why terms like volcel, which is short for voluntary celibacy, and boy sober have been trending on social media. So what's this all about? Why is not having sex seemingly the hot new sex trend? Let's talk about it. In today's show, we're going to explore what it really means to be voluntarily celibate, how many people are practicing this, common reasons for taking a break from sex, gender differences in voluntary celibacy, and more. We'll also explore the potential benefits and drawbacks of celibacy and tips on making the most of it if it's something that you want to pursue. I am joined once again by Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens, an award-winning associate professor at Emory University's Rollins School of Public Health, where she studies sexual wellness and liberation. With over 70 published articles, Dr. Hargens has made substantial contributions to the field. Her work has been featured widely in the popular media, and she is author of the new book, Good Sex, which will be published in February 2025. This is going to be another fascinating conversation. Stick around, and we're going to jump in right after the break. Do you want to learn more from me in the form of an online or in-person course? Become sexceptional by getting certified with Sexual Health Alliance, where you can learn from yours truly and a number of top sexuality scholars. Each year with Sexual Health Alliance, I teach courses like Fantasies Around the World, as well as immersive study abroad classes in several exciting countries. Join these programs and become a certified sexuality professional at the same time. From sex therapists to sex educators, sex coaches to sexologists, Sexual Health Alliance streamlines your path to certification while allowing you to learn from leading experts in the field. Most importantly, you'll gain the knowledge, skills, and credentials that you need to excel. Become sexceptional and connect with world-class experts and an engaged community of sexuality professionals from all across the globe. Start your path to certification today at sexualhealthalliance.com. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting Sex Science. Okay, Candace, let's talk about voluntary celibacy. Now, whenever I discuss this topic on social media, I always get a bunch of questions about what it means, as in people are just taking a break from sex, or are they also taking a break from masturbation? So let's start with a definition. What does it mean to be voluntarily celibate, and can this look different for different people?
Absolutely, because I like to let people self-define. So I'm always asking, what do you mean when you say that you're voluntarily celibate? And for some people, it's like, I'm not engaging in any sexual behaviors. Solo sex is included in that. And for some people, it's like, I'm not engaging in any partnered sex. And for some people, it's like, I'm engaging in partnered sex, but not penetration. And so it depends on who you're talking to and what their values are around that, what they're hoping to get from voluntary celibacy.
Yeah, the way I often discuss it in my textbook, The Psychology of Human Sexuality, is that you've got complete celibacy and then you've got partial celibacy, with complete celibacy being full abstaining from all partnered activity and solo sexual activity. And then partial celibacy means you're abstaining either from all partnered sex or just certain forms of it, and solo sexual behaviors are permitted in that. So yeah, celibacy is one of those things that different people are going to give you different answers for it. So it's kind of hard to pin down one specific or precise definition just because it does have that varied meaning.
But I like how you broke it down. That way people can understand if you're taking all sex in all ways off the table, it helps people better define sex, right? And so when you ask people what sex is and they only think it's penetrative, penis and vagina sex, and then you're like, okay, if you're celibate or you're abstaining from sex, what all activities are included in that, they can get to expand their definition of sex that way.
Yeah. And, I think for some people who are celibate, kissing and other forms of physical intimacy might still be on the menu, but they're just taking a break from sex. So, yeah, can mean lots of different things. Now, we've been hearing a lot in the popular media lately about voluntary celibacy, but we've also been hearing a lot about involuntary celibacy. So, just so we're all clear on this, how is involuntary celibacy different from what we're talking about here?
The choice in it makes the difference, right? So, is the person making an intentional decision to abstain from sexual experiences, or do they feel that they don't have access to the type of sexual experiences they were hoping to have? And I think even under like involuntary celibacy, there can be a lot of criticism for people feeling like they're expected to have certain access to sex, or that, they're entitled to certain type of sexual experiences, and that people are withholding something from them that they deserve or they earned or they worked for. So that's tricky space in how people talk about incel culture, involuntary celibacy.
Yeah, and I've devoted a whole episode previously to the psychology of incel. So for listeners who are curious to hear more about that, you can check out that previous episode. But we're focusing here on voluntary celibacy, which is quite different in terms of its underlying reasons and motivations and how it's experienced. Now, earlier this year, we conducted a nationally representative survey at the Kinsey Institute about sex and relationships, and our data can shed some light on how common voluntary celibacy is. So specifically, we found that 16.5% of women describe themselves as being single by choice and reported that they are not sexually active right now. And I'm using that because I think it's a reasonable proxy for voluntary celibacy. We didn't ask specifically, are you voluntarily celibate? But single by choice and not sexually active seems like a reasonable proxy. Now, the corresponding number for men was 9%. By contrast, we did also ask about involuntary celibacy, just in case people are curious, and 3.3% of men and 2.3% of women describe themselves as being involuntarily celibate. So these figures would suggest that voluntary celibacy is quite common, and it's certainly much more common than involuntary celibacy. So let's talk about the reasons for it. So generally speaking, why might someone decide to take a break from sex and dating for a while?
Sometimes I've been laughing because my friends who are in the dating space right now are like, there's pee in the dating pool and I just don't want to do this anymore. So they want to take a break because they've had some bad experiences and they just need a moment to press pause and be reflective. Sometimes they've had the transition or termination of a relationship and they just, want a chance to recover and think through what they want sexually and what they want romantically. Sometimes a person has a goal in mind for their professional life or for their personal life. And they're like, I really want to focus as much attention possible in this direction. And so I'm taking sex off the table to be able to focus. And some people have spiritual or religious reasons that they choose that. And so it may be that they are living according to a certain set of values, and within the context of those values, they take sexual experiences off the table for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, and those are all definitely reasons why people might decide to take a break from it. And when we're talking about voluntary celibacy, we should also add that there's further complexity in that it could be taking a break just from partnered sexual activities, or it could be taking a break from partnered sex and relationships for a time. You could also be celibate within a relational context. We know that that happens as well. So again, it's a complex term that means a lot of different things. But in terms of some of those other reasons that people might report for voluntary celibacy, I think a big part of it today is that For many folks, they're just exhausted with online dating, which, as we've discussed on the show before, can become soul sucking, right? Because you can spend countless hours just swiping through profiles, having these conversations that just never seem to go anywhere. You also can have experiences with people catfishing you or ghosting you. And it's just sometimes people just want to escape that for a while because there can be so much toxic behavior that happens online.
They do. And I think for the people who are in that experience, using the voluntary celibacy time to better understand what they want, better understand who they are, what behaviors they're attracted to that may not actually serve their relationships well, and what sex can mean for them if it hasn't meant what they wanted it to mean before. I think it's a useful time to be able to do that.
Yeah. And I think that's a great opportunity to sort of start building up what you need to know so that when you return to sex and dating, you can engage in more mindful dating and more mindful sex to make sure that you're getting your needs met and that the goals that you're pursuing are consistent with the goals that you actually have for your sex life and your relationships. A couple of other reasons I've seen in terms of why some people might be voluntarily celibate. One reason for women is that they often see sex as being risky. So, in a study of women who were voluntarily celibate, the single most common reason that they reported was that sex is just too risky right now, especially in this era where reproductive rights are being rolled back in many parts of the US and many other parts around the world. And so, that is a concern that is unique to a lot of women, is in terms of that threat to reproductive health. And so that's an important consideration here. And then also in terms of men, one kind of unique reason for them that I've seen in the research is that some guys seem to think that taking a break from sex and being abstinent for a while is going to enhance their masculinity. So this is talked about in the research as exalted masculinity, where they think that not having orgasms or ejaculations is going to like boost their testosterone or something and give them more self-control and make them more manly in other ways. As we've discussed on the show before, there really isn't any science to this idea that abstinence boosts testosterone or anything like that, but it's a reason that some guys seem to be pursuing voluntary celibacy.
Yeah, and I think for me, I want to first agree with you that we don't have, I haven't seen anyway, the science that supports that. But I will say that if we're thinking about it from the framework of sexual scripts around manhood, then I understand how if your script around your gender has been that you always want sex, you're always sexually available, and that the focus of most of your attention should go in sexual pursuits because that's how you one up other men by having more sexual conquest, then taking that power back from that narrative can be really powerful. So even if there's not an empirical proof that your testosterone level shifts, perhaps you feel more confident because you are able to transgress a cultural script around sex and your gender. And so I can see the empowerment on that side. That's my most compassionate lens for how that narrative gets talked about.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you on that. In that, I think for men who want to take a break from sex and maybe, if it is tied to certain ideas around masculinity and it ends up making them feel more empowered, that can be a positive thing. But don't do it because you think it's going to boost your testosterone. Like, there's just no data to support that idea. So in our study, we found that more women seem to be voluntarily celibate than men. And most popular media reports on the topic tend to focus on women, where you see terms like boy sober having gone mainstream as being the synonym for voluntary celibacy. So do you have any thoughts on that in terms of like why women right now might be more likely to be hitting pause on their sex lives?
Well, I think you hit a really key point around reproductive justice, and people are just afraid that, any sexual experience that might turn into conception could be really traumatic or terrifying. Like I live in Georgia, and as a Black woman experiencing reproductive health challenges, I can totally understand why people would take that off the table. But for more intentional reasons or life affirming reasons, perhaps that narrative of sex doesn't have to be the only way I connect with someone. And so learning other types of intimacy could be an option. When you use terms like voiceover, it's like maybe there was some compulsion or addiction or desperation that they're dealing with that they want to unpack a bit and release. And so taking sex off the table and being celibate might help them do that a bit more, developing discipline around how they use sex, refining, thinking about Cindy Meston's work, refining their ideas about like their sexual motivations and how they've used sex before. So I'm curious really about the differentials that make voluntary sexual abstinence for women and men. I would love to read more about that, but I think for the women that I've talked to and some of the research participants who are like, okay, I'm not having sex right now because usually those are the reasons. It's like, I probably have done more than I wanted to do sexually with people that quote unquote didn't deserve it, or, who mistreated me, or I felt like I overextended myself and I want to draw back a little bit. So setting a different sexual boundary.
Yeah, and you got me thinking about something here when you said that term voiceover is very telling because it is, right? And I think it has to do with the fact that women on average tend to encounter a lot more toxic behavior on dating apps than men do, where they might be inundated with messages from people where they're sending unsolicited dick pics and encountering harassment and other things like that. Reaction is very different when somebody receives an unsolicited nude based on gender, right? And women are much more likely to have a negative reaction to an unsolicited nude than men are. And we've got data to back that up. And so I think that that is kind of part of what's going on here, given that there's been this big shift toward online dating in recent years. More people have started to have those negative experiences, might feel inundated by them. And so maybe they just want to take a break from all of that for a while. So it's not just about sex. It's just also about dating, relationships, and getting away from that toxic behavior.
And I will add that, and you know this research well, many of you and your colleagues have looked at like the disparity in orgasm and pleasure. And so, if sex isn't that satisfying or that pleasurable for some women, I can understand why you would just take it off the table. It's like it was all right to begin with. It wasn't all that. And so since it wasn't, I can do without it for a while until I'm in a position to better communicate, or if I find someone who feels more eager, enthusiastic about contributing to a pleasurable sexual experience. So I can get that too, where, if the percentage of cis women, heterosexual women in particular, who are going to orgasm at last encounter is so different than that for cis heterosexual men, then it's like, I don't have as much to lose.
Yeah, there's definitely a connection here with the orgasm gap. And when you take like what's going on right now, where you've got all these big discussions about the orgasm gap or pleasure gap, and then you've also got this heightened state of threat when it comes to reproductive rights, sex for a lot of young women in particular can become this high risk, low reward kind of thing. Like, why do I want to participate in an activity where it does carry these significant risks and I'm also not getting pleasure, right? So I think that can be part of the calculus for some women in terms of explaining why there might be a gender difference in pursuit of voluntary celibacy.
Yeah, and I like to honor that that is sexual liberation too. So I know there's been a lot of talking back with the sex positivity movement and people feeling like it was just, too closely aligned with like girl boss feminism and like you could just do everything and have all the sex and all of that. I'm like, sure, if that's what you want, but if it's not what you actually want, and you want an experience or a time in life where sex is off the table and it's autonomous and thoughtful, that can be sex positive in the same way that you having sex with as many people as you want when you want is.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We often talk a lot about the problems of men feeling all of this pressure to conform to traditional ideas and notions of masculinity and the negative effects that that can have. But there's also negative effects of these contemporary ideals of what women should be and what they should pursue and how they should act. And it puts a lot of pressure on women too, in a lot of ways. And so, yeah, I think a lot of this is just about making the empowering or liberating choice for you at this particular point in time. Now, something else we found in our research was that voluntary celibacy seemed to be most common among the youngest adults and the oldest adults. And I think that that's probably driven by different factors based on age. So, for example, as we were just talking about, for young people, particularly women who are at peak fertility, the risk calculation for sex is just quite different. But by contrast, for older adults, especially if we're talking about women who have gone through menopause where reproduction is no longer possible, the considerations are quite different. Sex doesn't carry that same risk, but there can be other things that might factor into that decision there. So anecdotally, it seems like many older women are taking a break from sex and relationships in pursuit of independence. Many women in relationships feel like they become the caretakers of their partners and that their partner's needs are prioritized over theirs, and find that singlehood offers some freedom to focus on themselves for a change. So, what do you think? Does that explanation make sense to you?
It does. And depending on what generation you were raised in, the cultural scripts around who women are supposed to be in romantic relationships and what you're supposed to offer and the balance of emotional labor and things like that. Like I've talked to so many people, even my married friends who are my like middle age like me, who are like, would you get married again? Like, okay, I love my partner, but no, not never. Don't want to be in a marriage situation again. I don't know that I would take sex all the way off the table. That would be a totally different thing. But a lot of people are saying that, men and women, but a lot more women, because it's just like the amount of work that goes into it to maintain a relationship like that. Once you're on the other side of that, it's like, well, I could spend a lot less time and energy in that way. But one thing I also think about on the side of women who are post-menopause is sexual functioning. And so maybe you're experiencing sexual pain more often, or you never got good messaging around the use of lubrication or how arousal and desire can shift depending on your hormone levels and your body changes as you go through menopause. And so I've been seeing some really great information more recently than I ever have around perimenopause and menopause, with people on social media opening the conversation about that and giving more updated, older, like 45, 55, 65-year-old facing sex ed that is incorporating that conversation. And so that's really nice and refreshing to see.
Yeah, and I think you highlight the fact that, when it comes to sex, it's always biopsychosocial, right? And there's not just the sociocultural reasons in terms of like what's happening right now in our culture, but there's also our individual psychology and where we are in life, and then the biology factors and how our bodies change over time. And all of that can play a role in terms of these decisions people are making about whether they want to pursue sex right now or whether they want to take a break from it. So, as sex researchers, we often talk about the benefits of sex. So, it might seem paradoxical for us to talk about the benefits of not having sex, but what could some of those benefits be? In what ways might taking a break from sex be good for us?
For a lot of people who have decided to go on this journey, people that I've talked with or worked with, they were focusing on a professional goal, and they found that taking sex off the table and the related like dating stuff that we were talking about earlier went with it, but it really was the sex piece helped them to feel more focused, like they had more time and energy to concentrate on that aspect of their lives. Some people used it to kind of reaffirm a more positive body image. And so they were like, because of the way I've experienced sex, like I want to be better in tune with my own body. So they were partially celibate because they were using solo sex, but not partnered sex. And they were like, I want to affirm my own body and get to know myself. And what better way to understand what I need than to take a year or take 6 months or whatever they were taking and focus on my solo sex and my sexual well-being, just me. And so those are some of the benefits of it, because to your point earlier, when you're engaging in partner sex, then sometimes your attention is split because you want to contribute to a pleasant sexual experience for your partner as well as yourself. And in this way, you get to focus exclusively on your own sexual experience. Some people have felt like if they take sex completely off the table in a dating space, they have more room and energy to get to know their partner on a friendship level. and see if it's somebody they want to move forward with. So they've tried that, and that was beneficial. I see mixed results on that, honestly, but it was a strategy that they were employing because they wanted to know that their relationship could stand the test of time in the event that if sex was off the table for other reasons, that they might not be able to last.
Yeah, I think that's all great information. And, again, as much as we as sex researchers love to talk about why sex is good for us, it can also be good to not do it for a while if you're doing it for reasons like the ones that you just described there. So there can be benefits to taking a break from sex.
I think almost any reason other than because you feel like you're going to be a better human being than other human beings if you aren't having sex is okay. Like, so if you're like, well, I'm more moral than you, or I'm more religious or special or all of these things than you as like trying to create or reinforce a human hierarchy, I think that whatever reason you choose that works for you is just fine.
Yep. And I agree with that. So, we've talked about some of the benefits of voluntary celibacy, but it's important to acknowledge that some people find this to be really hard. So, what are some of the challenges or drawbacks of being voluntarily celibate?
Think that sex is an enjoyable experience. And so maybe you have to find other things that bring you joy in life because you find that that was such a robust part of your pleasure activism or like the good things. And you're like, oh, I don't have as much like that I could rely on for that type of joy or pleasure. So some people find it tough in that regard. Some people feel like they don't know how to engage in other forms of intimacy. So they have to develop skills around intellectual intimacy or recreational intimacy or physical but non sexual intimacy because they haven't developed those skills yet. And I think some people just feel incredibly lonely. And so sex was one of the ways that they felt connected to others, not just on the intimacy side, but just like, a sense of belonging. And so they feel without that sex or the sexual community they've created that they feel lonely.
Yeah, and that sense of loneliness is definitely key and one of the biggest drawbacks, especially for people who are taking both sex and dating off the menu, right? Because you still need to meet those needs for social and intimate connection with other people. And so your friendships are going to have to take on greater priority or importance if you're voluntarily celibate because you still need those emotional support outlets and those opportunities to connect with other people. So having that supporting network, I think, can certainly make the transition into voluntary celibacy and the experience of it to be a bit more manageable. But when you don't have that network, it can be quite a bit harder. Now, returning to our survey, an interesting finding was that women seem to be more content with their decision to be voluntarily celibate compared to men. And I have some thoughts on why that might be the case, but I'm curious to ask you first whether you have any ideas as to why women might find voluntary celibacy to be more satisfying than men.
Well, I think it's easier to align with the social scripts of womanhood than it is for manhood. And so, there are social sanctions for some men in their community or in their friend group if you don't have a sexual story to talk about. And, like you're not necessarily ostracized, but you might be picked on or, like belittled a bit. And even if it's in jest, you feel that. Whereas oftentimes women don't have that as much. And so you're kind of being congruent with these expectations of womanhood versus incongruent for men. And then I think that we talked about the pleasure disparities or the orgasm gap. And so if the sex was just okay to begin with that you've been having for 10 years of your life, taking it off the table is like, oh, I'm not missing that much versus if you're likely to orgasm in most of your sexual encounters and you take that off the table, it could be a little bit harder.
Yeah, and I think you make a really important point there about sexual scripts that exist in our society and how it is kind of expected for men to have more sex and more sexual partners, and that there is some masculinity benefit or social status boost that they might get from it. Versus for women, it's kind of normalized for them to not be in pursuit of sex because women are more likely to be judged or shamed for expressing their sexual wants and desires. And so, yeah, that could definitely be a factor in all of this. As I think about other potential reasons, it might also be related to gender differences and just amount of desire for sex and desire for sexual variety. We know that on average, men tend to report more desire and more desire for variety than women do. Of course, there are vast individual differences, and some women are much higher on this than some men are, but on average, there is a difference. And so that could also be contributing to some of this. And then I also think it's possible that some of the guys that we're categorizing as voluntarily celibate here, maybe they're actually involuntarily celibate, but they're choosing the label of voluntary celibacy because it's more empowering for them to say that they're opting out of sex and dating as opposed to saying, I can't find a relationship partner. So I don't know. There could be a lot of different things going on here.
I didn't even think about that, but I can see that too. It's kind of a saving face.
Yeah, and I think there could be something about that where maybe it preserves their self-worth, self-esteem, sense of masculinity in some way to say that they're making the decision to opt out of sex and dating. We need more research to know whether that's actually the case or not, but just one of the many hypotheses and that I have in terms of thinking about all of this. And there's almost no research out there on voluntary celibacy in modern times. I mean, most of the work that's out there on celibacy is like historical stuff, dating long ways back, and often in terms of like very specific social or cultural environments, like celibacy as it relates to pursuit of certain religious roles, or celibacy in prison settings or during epidemics and pandemics, right? Celibacy is often explored in those very specific contexts. And in modern times, most of the work on celibacy in terms of research is on involuntary celibacy. So we just don't know as much about the people who are opting out of sex and dating. And I would love to see more research on that. Now, for people who might be voluntarily celibate or want to give it a try, do you have any tips or advice you can share on making the most of it in terms of maximizing some of those personal benefits and minimizing some of the challenges?
Yeah, I would suggest that you set a time frame, an initial time frame that works for you, and maybe write down a few activities that you had gotten away from that you would love to reintegrate back into your life so that you feel like you have something that can be a behavior that you would do instead, so that you're like, well, I haven't taken this dance class that I've wanted to take, and I've been saying I'll do it for years. Now's the time to try that thing out. Or, I wanted to paint again, or whatever that thing is that's an enjoyable activity. And it might not be enjoyable to you in the same way sex is, but it also could be something that opens up some creativity or a sense of meaning or well being in a way that sex was doing for you at one point in your life. So having things that you swap out for the sexual experience in that time frame. I also recommend journaling about the experience. Talk about it in your journal when those hard days come up and it's like, man, today was a rough day, and what made it rough? What emotions were there? What sensations were in your body? How do you attune to arousal when you're not going to do anything to change your arousal state and just going to let it dissipate? Like writing that up and being grateful that your body still has that capacity, even though you're not using it in that way. So those are some of the suggestions.
Yeah, I think that's all great advice. And I think a great mindset to have if you're pursuing voluntary celibacy is looking at it as opportunity, right? And it's opportunity to pursue things that you want to do on your own terms. And, this has me thinking about the literature on post breakup, post divorce recovery, and how, in terms of one of the things that people find most helpful in terms of recovering faster from the end of a relationship is by focusing on that personal growth and development. It's just one of those things that not only gives us something to do and focus on, but it also is expanding our sense of self. And, when we're not in relationships, we're not meeting our self-expansion needs and novelty needs as much. And so, we need to find ways to go out and continue to grow and expand and, in some cases, rediscover the self.
There's a reason why the breakup body is real.
Yep.
But I will say that when I was going through a breakup years ago and I chose to be celibate for a year, and it was rough, it was very difficult, but also it was probably one of the healthiest times of my life where I integrated all of these things that I had forgotten about that I love to do. And so I bring that up not just from my reading of the literature, but also from lived experience.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for all of this amazing information, Candace. It was truly a pleasure to have you here. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work?
Sure, you can go to my website, drcandicenichole.com, or you can follow me on IG or Facebook and Threads at Dr. Candice Nicole, Candice with an I, CandiceNicole. And you can pre-order Good Sex on any bookseller. I have the Good Sex Books bookshop, but you can order it on Amazon or Barnes and Nobles or wherever you find books.
Well, I will be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. You can also follow me on the socials for daily sex research updates. I'm on Twitter and TikTok at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. And if you have a question you'd like me to answer on a future episode of this show, you can leave me a podcast voicemail at speakpipe.com/sex and psychology. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.